Our next session shifts the focus to leadership and legitimacy in the modern age. Co-moderating this fireside chat is the founder and CEO of Van Media Group. With 25 years of international journalism experience, working with industry titans like CNN International, CNBC Asia, and NHK Japan, let's all welcome, no less than Mr. Glenn Van Zutphen.
Thank you, thank you.
Also joining Glenn in this panel to steer the discussion here is a veteran Filipino journalist, a seasoned columnist, and an editorial consultant at Rappler. He hosts a weekly program called In the Public Square, lectures on media and politics at the Ateneo de Manila University, and co-convenes the Consortium on Democracy and Disinformation. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. John Nery.
Hello, good morning. So yes, I'm John Nery. I'm a journalist from the Philippines, and it's my happy task to serve with Glenn Van Zutphen as co-moderator of this fascinating experiment in a double panel. Our session is actually two sets of experts, one on the United States, the other one on the Philippines, joined together by a focus on political comebacks. What explains the return to power of Donald Trump in the United States and the Marcos dynasty, represented by Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in the Philippines? I look forward to what promises to be a truly engaging conversation.
John, thank you very much. I would like to start, before we get into our actual panel discussion, a quick poll among you in the audience. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if it's appropriate. How many of you live in a country or are from a country right now that has had some sort of populist or nativist movement emerge in the past 10 years? How many of you are from a country or live in a country where there is a populist or nativist movement emerging in the past 10 years? Don't be shy. Okay, I think the rest of you are probably not telling the truth, because if we look from 2016, right, we think back to the UK, the US, France, Italy, Germany, Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, Brazil, and Indonesia in more recent times, there has been a massive shift in going back to roots that people have once explored. And I know that there are a lot of you emerging young politicians in the room today, so welcome to you. The world that you are inheriting as future politicians is a very dynamic one, and as we saw in our first panel this morning, some would say a fractured one as well. Briefly, my good friend John gave me a history lesson this morning and reminded me of a very interesting thing that happened 60 years ago in the Philippines. And that was the OG Ferdinand Marcos and his campaign slogan. Anybody remember what it was? 1966? Help make this nation great again. So that was Ferdinand Marcos in 1966. So we see the arc of history again repeating itself, as it often does, but this idea of pulling people back into their countries and coming back, as Trump has done since 2016, as the Marcos family has done since Duterte times in 2016, this is all coming back to play again. There are a lot of reasons for it. We're going to talk about that now. We're going to talk about how leaders are enabled to reclaim power after a defeat, or how political marginalization has changed countries. To do that, we are going to first let our panelists have just a few minutes, 3 minutes maybe each, to give us an overview of their view, and then we'll come back in and do some Q&A. At the end, we'll have time for your questions, so please be thinking about your questions as well. Back to my good friend John, who's going to introduce our panelists from the Philippines.
Thank you, Glenn. OG is right. I mean, Ferdinand Marcos was literally the original gangster. Allow me to introduce the members of the Philippine panel. There's a lot of information about them on the excellent ACPC website. So I just want to highlight something about their life experiences. by offering a set of numbers. The first member of the Philippine panel, former Senator, now Congresswoman Laila de Lima, may be introduced best by the numbers 682. 682. She spent a total of 6 years, 8 months, and 2 days in jail.
21.
I'm sorry.
21 days.
My mistake. 6/8/21. 6 years, 8 months, and 21 days in jail on trumped-up charges brought by the administration and by the very person of President Rodrigo Duterte. I'm very happy that she's able to join us in the relative freedom of a political conference. The second member of the Philippine panel, I'll introduce her by saying the numbers 12, 10, and 1. 12 years ago, at a very young age, Professor Nicole Curato received one of the country's most prestigious prizes, the confusingly named 10 Outstanding Young Men Award in the Philippines. And that was for her work as a leading sociologist. And she's one of the leading scholars in the relatively new academic discipline known as deliberative democracy. So I'd like to welcome both Professor Nicole and Congresswoman Laila to the forum.
All right, and my turn to do some introductions on this end of the stage. You see how we're doing this split panel today? It's quite interesting. To my immediate right is Dr. Adrian Ang, the research fellow and coordinator for the United States program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. His research interests include American public opinion, political parties, elections, campaigns, voting behavior, and congressional politics. Wow, that's a lot going on in all of those at the moment. And sitting just to Adrian's right, toward the center, is Colonel Steve Okun, the CEO of APEC Advisors and Public Advisory Consultancy, working with clients on ESG, sustainability, and stakeholder engagement. Steve has lived and worked in Asia since 2003, has worked for KKR as its first director of Asia Public Affairs, as head of public affairs for UPS, and responsibilities looking at government affairs, communication, stakeholder engagement, etc. Steve served in the Clinton administration and is a graduate of the University of Virginia and the University of Virginia Law School. Please, a nice round of applause for this end of the panel.
Thank you. We started about 10 minutes late, so I'm guessing we're going to end around 10 minutes late also, around 12:20. So let's get started. The first person, the first expert, to help set the stage, Congresswoman Laila de Lima.
Thank you very much, John. I'm so very pleased to be part of this panel on a very interesting subject matter, to be with very distinguished co-panelists and equally distinguished moderators. I initially intended to start with immediately comparing the Marcos comeback and the Trump comeback, but I changed my mind and go straight to the point of pointing out, highlighting precisely the major points that characterize the comeback of the Marcos dynasty. There are actually 8 points. The narrative of return. Marcos framed his political ascent as a narrative of redemption and historical correction. Through carefully crafted messaging, he sought to recast the Marcos name, not as a symbol of corruption and authoritarianism, but as a misunderstood era of discipline and national progress, by appealing to nostalgia, harnessing social media revisionism, and downplaying the atrocities of martial law. And what was the core message of the campaign? I'm talking about the 2022 presidential campaign. It was unity, national healing, and stability after years of division. So by invoking unity, Marcos' son sought to transcend the bitter divisions between the Marcos loyalists and his critics, and also between old political dynasties and new Philippine movements, as well as between rich and poor Filipinos deeply disillusioned by decades of political bickering. Now, the source of power of the Marcoses in their resurgence, dynastic nostalgia, the inherited myth of the golden era. So the source of power lies deeply rooted in dynastic nostalgia and the enduring myth of the Marcos Golden Age, a romanticized memory of his father's rule that continues to resonate among many Filipinos disillusioned with the post-EDSA era. So selectively invoking the infrastructure boom and order of the 1970s while downplaying the corruption, the cronyism, the excesses, the human rights abuses, all those, the extrajudicial killings, the torture, and all other repressive acts of martial law. So this inherited myth functioned as both emotional capital and political armor. And what was the strategy? Like Trump, the digital strategy, TikTok, YouTube, he engaged in the campaign of Marcos Jr. was anchored on a sophisticated campaign to reshape public memory and engage younger generations who did not live through martial law. The younger generation, the Filipinos, the young Filipinos have very little knowledge and awareness about the excesses of martial law. So by appealing to the youth's appetite for short, visually engaging content and their general disillusionment with traditional politics, Marcos Jr. turned social media into both a battleground for historical narrative and a recruitment tool for a new generation of loyalists who view his family's legacy not as a tyranny, but as a misunderstood greatness. Now, how about populist appeal? Is Marcos Jr. a populist? Does he possess populist appeal? That's actually debatable. But he actually has a soft, soothing form of populism. He avoids confrontational discourse. He's conflict averse. He has calm posture. He relies on a polished, family-friendly imagery. And if you compare him to his predecessor, Mr. Duterte, so it's a soft, soothing kind of populism. He seems to have offered order and continuity. Now, how about alliances and elite support? His rise to power was actually anchored on a broad and pragmatic coalition that united key segments of the Philippine political elite, notably the Duterte bloc, old Marcos loyalists, and influential regional power brokers. They brought together, when they joined forces, the Marcoses and the Duterte, although it was short-lived in 2022 presidential elections, they brought together two formidable political dynasties and consolidated the North and the South. The North controlled by the Marcoses, the South controlled by the Dutertes, and ensured mass appeal across geographic and social lines. So it was the reframing of the past, sanitized dictatorship as disciplined and prosperous, cast the father as a visionary. But it was a great lie, the golden era, and they managed to actually rebrand that. And the institutional context was such that the Marcoses benefited from weak opposition, from political fatigue, and disillusionment with democracy. So, personality-centered, of course. The movement character was personality-centered, but nothing ideological. There's no political movement at all. The Marcoses were in it out of glamour and nostalgia, but no stable, fixed, focused political movement. So I don't think it would last beyond 2028. So I will stop there. and just elaborate on that later during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Adrian?
Got it. Sorry. Dr. Adrian Ang now will give us his comments as well.
Thanks, Glenn. I thought what I'd do is right, sort of for everyone's benefit, to try and situate Trump's comeback in American political history. So what I'll do is right, sort of do a brief romp through American history in terms of political comebacks. And the first figure we come to is Aaron Burr. And right, sort of for all you fans of Hamilton, the musical, right, sort of Burr is more than just, right, the man who wounds and fatally wounds Alexander Hamilton. He was Thomas Jefferson's first vice president. But right, sort of the killing of Hamilton puts an end basically to Burr's political career, right? And in his trying to mount a political comeback, right, sort of he ends up venturing into like the Louisiana territory and gets himself into some conspiracy to set up a breakaway republic. And he ends up being charged with treason, right? Thomas Jefferson charges Burr with treason, and right, so this basically, puts this one comeback to an end. Right? Then we get to 1824. 1824 is important in American political history because, right, we had an election with four main principal candidates. Right, this is as the era of good feelings, as it was called, was coming to an end. The first party system is coming to an end. And because there were four principal candidates, no one single candidate won a majority of the electoral votes. So it went to the House. Right? The House of Representatives had a contingent election, and one of the main candidates, Andrew Jackson, won a plurality of both the electoral votes and the popular votes. And Andrew Jackson thought, right, he was going to be the front runner to win the presidency in the House. Right? But the House votes for John Quincy Adams, son of the second president of the United States, right, John Adams. And Jackson is furious, right? He talks about a corrupt bargain that puts John Quincy Adams in the House, right? And so Jackson then nurses this grievance, right, that drives him to the election of 1828, right? And with Jackson in power, right, how this sort of relates to Trump is, right, over the weekend we just had the No Kings demonstrations, right? The argument's like, Donald Trump wants to be king, right? But if we go back to look at the Jackson era, one of the accusations against Andrew Jackson was he wanted to be king. Right? You can see, you can Google, right, sort of the political cartoons of the time. Andrew Jackson is accused of being King Andrew, right? And besides that, right, sort of Jackson was also a political outsider. Right? So he goes to Washington, upends norms, practices, right? Is arguably the first populist in the White House. Right? Then we have another example of a political comeback. Grover Cleveland. So before Trump, right, Grover Cleveland was the only other American president to serve non-consecutive terms. Right? And why is Cleveland relevant? Because, right, sort of the political issues of the time. Right? And what were the political issues of the time? Tariffs. Right? But then, right, we have President Trump talking about William McKinley as his favorite president. Right? Because, right, McKinley was for tariffs. Right? Tariffs is the most beautiful word in the English language. Right? Cleveland was a Democrat, right? And he wanted lower tariffs, right? And tariffs brought him back into office, right? And sort of, I think the final example of a political comeback is Richard Nixon. Nixon loses to Jack Kennedy in the 1960 elections, very close, right? And allegations of electoral shenanigans, right, with the mob and the Chicago machine carrying Illinois for Jack Kennedy, right? But Nixon says, no, I am not going to contest the elections, right? It is better for American democracy, right, that Kennedy has a legitimate win, right? But that is not the end of Nixon's political career, right? He goes back to California, right? He tries to run in the 1962 gubernatorial election, right? And he loses like something like by 5 million votes, right? This is when Nixon gives his, you will no longer have Richard Nixon to kick around, right? But again, right, that's not the end. 1964 is a disastrous year, right, for the Republicans. Goldwater loses in a landslide to LBJ, right? But Nixon, right, manages to steer clear of that disaster, right? Which then allows him to mount a comeback in 1968, right? But then again, right, what is the lesson of Nixon for the Trump context? How does the Nixon presidency end, right? In impeachment, right? So before Trump, right, Nixon is impeached by the House of Representatives, but he resigns, right, before he is formally tried by the Senate. So, right, we have great political comebacks in I think, American political history, but I will leave it to Steve, right, sort of to, I think, show how unique Trump is in terms of political comebacks in the American context.
Thank you, Doc Adrian. Now I'd like to call on Professor Nicole.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for bringing all of us here together. So the last time I joined the Asian Conference for Political Communication was back in 2017, when I spoke about my research on the popular appeal of then newly elected strongman Rodrigo Duterte. So for those who are less familiar with Philippine politics, Duterte's rule was marked by a brutal war on drugs that left thousands dead, mostly from poor urban communities. His government targeted journalists and political opponents, some of them are in this room, and he now faces charges of crimes against humanity at The Hague. So at that time, my work and my research team's work tried to understand why so many Filipinos found his cruelty appealing. Fast forward to 2022, as my team and I prepared to study the presidential election, we expected to see the same kind of hate-filled discourse dominating the campaign. But what surprised us, both in the Philippines and in Indonesia, because it was a comparative study, was that the comeback narratives of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., and Prabowo Subianto, a former military general accused of human rights abuses during the Suharto regime, were not built on anger or aggression, but on what we call, and stay with me, these are very technical terms, their campaigns were built on good vibes and toxic positivity. So in Indonesia, this came in the form of Prabowo repackaging himself as the cuddly and cute grandfather. In the Philippines, the late dictator's son focused his message, as Congresswoman De Lima mentioned, on healing, moving on, unity, which minimizes the brutality of the past and reframing criticism as negativity and bad vibes. So what are the characteristics of toxic positivity as an influence operation that shaped a political comeback? So first, we found that toxic positivity individualized collective struggles, suggesting that the nation's hardship was really just a matter of mindset, of positive thinking, rather than political structure. So the Marcos family recast themselves as victims of persecution in 1986 when their family was deposed from power through a popular uprising. So the Marcos family urged Filipinos to embrace forgiveness and stop bickering, bickering as his term for presidential debates. So politics in this framing became less about accountability than about attitude. Let's just think positively and the Philippines will actually be in good shape. Second, toxic positivity sanitized history. So instead of joining debates or interviews with credible journalists, Marcos Jr.'s campaign built his own media world on YouTube and on TikTok. So for example, on YouTube, he was seen teasing his sons about their girlfriends, playing Mobile Legends with gaming micro-celebrities, and bursting into laughter as he played the lie detector test challenge with his wife. So this light-hearted, influencer-style aesthetic made the Marcoses appear fun, authentic, and relatable, while making the electoral critique seem bitter or outdated. So a lot of his political fans were actually criticizing supporters of the political opposition as killjoys. Like, how dare you criticize this family? They're so fun. How dare you? They're so nice, right? That was part of the toxic positivity of the campaign. And finally, toxic positivity suppresses dissent. Not through force, but through social pressure. The phrase, "respect my opinion," became a go-to phrase of the Marcos supporters, which in effect shut down political deliberation. Influencers promoted disengagement as a sign of maturity, turning apathy into virtue. So our research suggests that this kind of positivity can just be as corrosive and destructive for democracy as overt repression that we witnessed in the Duterte regime. Because when politics becomes all about good vibes, it drains the moral and emotional energy needed for collective action and historical reckoning. It removes a divided country's capacity for deliberation, the power of having difficult conversations to seek common ground. I'll stop my comments there.
All right, thank you. And now we are going to finish up our opening statements with Steve Okun. Steve.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up where Adrian left off on Richard Nixon, who is Donald Trump's role model as a politician. But Trump's gone much further than Nixon ever went. So if you don't know anything about Richard Nixon, you only need to know this one quote that Nixon said. And Nixon said, "People react to fear, not love. They don't teach that in Sunday school." That was Nixon's philosophy as president, but he was constrained. He had guardrails against him. Donald Trump has eliminated almost all of those guardrails. And Donald Trump says, real power is, I don't even want to use the word fear. Donald Trump has used fear to take over the Republican Party. Essentially, anyone who opposed him in the Republican Party has been eliminated from that party because he has attacked them, he has gotten his followers to attack them, and the Republican Party of old does not exist anymore for all intents and purposes. It is now the Trump Party. And now, what else does Donald Trump use for fear? He goes after the media, he goes after universities, he goes after businesses, he goes after his political opponents, and you now see people getting indicted who had dared to oppose Donald Trump, even so far as to eliminate the career prosecutors in the Justice Department, who he has now steamrolled and his administration has steamrolled. So he has used fear, and then that is what has enabled him to take over the party and what has enabled him to have his comeback. And I just want to say that I really wish my country had more people like the Congresswoman and like John, because that's what we need in the United States. We need people like they have done to stand up to Trump, but we really don't have that right now. Okay, so how's Donald Trump been able to use fear to get his comeback? Okay, we are an extraordinarily divided country in the United States. We're basically a 50-50 country, and we're highly polarized. So now when the Democrats or the Republicans, and I'll put my political operative hat on, when the Democrats or the Republicans pick their primary candidate, as they did in 2024, there were basically three choices that the Republicans had. They had Trump Light, and then they had the establishment. Trump, of course, was the Trump candidate. The Trump light candidate was Governor DeSantis of Florida, and the establishment candidate was Nikki Haley. Now, if you're running a Republican primary and you know if you cross Trump, you are in deep trouble. That is why it was very difficult for Haley or DeSantis to get any traction, any real traction at all. And look, and if you're running a campaign and you're giving a choice to the voters of a candidate or the light version of the candidate, well, of course you go for the real version of the candidate. Who likes the diet stuff, right, when it comes to their politicians? So you go for the full octane, right, candidate that you can have. So Trump, through fear and through the way the Republican primary process works, is able to get that nomination for 2024 when, if you went on January 6th in the immediate aftermath of 2021, you didn't think he had a chance. But the structure of the Republican Party and the fear that that he had instilled in anyone to cross him of any meaningful, who wanted anything meaningful to go on in political life, they were all eliminated. So that's how he wins the Republican Party, the Republican primary. Now, how does he win the election? You have to give Trump credit because his political instincts are where Americans were at the time of the election, right? He had 3 issues that he recognized he was going to run on that the American people did not like where Joe Biden was and where Harris was as his successor. They did not like what was happening to the country on immigration. They did not like the fact that we had so many people coming into the United States who were unauthorized and that we weren't doing anything about it. So he ran hard on immigration. He ran hard on inflation. And that was something that the Democrats had a very difficult time to overcome. And the third thing he ran on was on wokeness. The Democrats had gotten way too far to the left of the country on social issues. It was the, he, him, she, her, they, them. It was all of the issues of girls playing boys sports, boys playing girls sports, and how that was unfair. It was all of these woke issues, and he tied into those 3 things. Now, he did not win he didn't win a majority of the vote in 2024. He has never won a majority of the vote. No time in his 3 times that he ran for president did a majority of Americans like him. But because of our electoral college system, because of the way we are structured, he was able to get that 3rd term. And it wasn't that people were voting for him. They were voting against Harris and Biden. And our elections, when it comes to a re-election of a president, it's not a choice between Harris and Trump. It's a referendum on Harris. And she lost that referendum. She was not a good candidate. Now, she will say it was because she only had 107 days. She didn't have time to break away from Biden. Biden should have dropped out in the midterms, and maybe that's all true. But it doesn't matter. He did win the Electoral College. He won the Electoral College clearly, and that was his comeback. But his comeback would not have survived without fear, and that fear still exists in the United States. Maybe we're starting to see some people stand up to him. We saw the No Kings rally. We've seen 6 of the 9 universities that he has threatened to withhold funding from stand up to him and say they weren't going to sign his agreement. We see the Democrats having some backbone in shutting down the government because too many people are going to lose health care or it's going to get extraordinarily expensive if they didn't do that. So we're starting to see some resistance like you saw in the Philippines, but it's still way too soon to know what is going to happen in the United States. I think we are in a very precarious position in our country's history right now.
Thanks, Steve. Since this is a conference on political communication, can we spend some time on the framing of narratives and the use of the media? And maybe, considering the time, maybe everyone on the panel should answer, right? Can you give specific examples? Nicole already did that, of how narratives were framed that helped them return to power. So maybe we can just go down the line.
Yeah, I would say just an example or 2 so we can move through this line of questioning fairly apace.
So I think for Trump, right, it begins after the 2020 election, right? So his narrative was already set that the election was stolen. So this allows him to have both a grievance, right? Sort of this is again back to the Jacksonian corrupt bargain that and it allows him to dominate sort of politics and the Republican Party in a way that, right, sort of no candidate until then has. And he is also able to channel, right, sort of his own personal grievance and sort of to externalize that, right, sort of to the public. Right, the large chunks of the Republican base that, right, sort of, my grievance is your grievance, right? I'm also representing your grievances because, right, sort of I'm the outsider and, right, sort of look how, right, the elites, right, are treating me.
Perfect. I'm going to stop you there. Steve, power of the media as it relates to Trump's narrative.
I mean, look, Trump has a very simple narrative. I mean, it's make America great again. Everybody knows it. I'll give $10 to anyone in this room right now who can tell me what Harris's 2024 campaign slogan was. What was it? That wasn't her official one. She said that was kind of chanted. It's when we fight, we win. And believe me, I just had to Google it because I forgot it too.
Just $5.
Yeah, no, fine, $2.50. $2.50. I'll give him $2.50. So if you don't have the narrative, you have to build that. You have to have that narrative that people can understand. Now, what you needed in the United States in terms of this narrative and in the grievances and making this a referendum on Biden and Harris, what Trump was brilliant to do in 2024 was he got these voters who normally don't vote. And it's typically young men, white men, Latino men. And these are voters who typically stay home. And they didn't stay home this time. They came out to vote. And why did he get them to come out to vote? Because he went to where they were. It wasn't Fox News and OAN and all of that right-wing nonsense that we have. And certainly, and Harris wasn't there on MSNBC, and you could say it on the left as well. He went to the podcasts, right? He went to Joe Rogan, and he went to all of those places where these voters who normally don't vote, right, they all came out. Enough, this is where he got enough to win. So it was the narrative that he had, and he got to the voters that he needed to get to, and that was enough to win. Again, he did not win a majority of Americans, but he got enough to win the Electoral College.
Thank you. Let's follow the same dynamic. Congresswoman, about narrative framing and then the use of the media.
Yes, it was really about a sophisticated campaign that started even years before 2022. It's about reframing martial law. It was about historical revisionism. So even before, as I said, years before 2022 presidential election, they started all of this social media campaign, engaging the youth, for example, because they know that the youth had very little knowledge about, awareness about martial law excesses. And so they harped on that. And the revisionism, that it was really a golden age, that it was overstated, exaggerated. The campaign, for example, of the left, the campaign of the critics, what they're saying about the Marcoses are exaggerated about the martial law, about the extrajudicial killings, the enforced disappearances. But these are recorded ones, and even the plunder, the plunder of billions of pesos, these are recorded ones. These are on court records. But they manage to really revise the narrative because of the use of social media. But as I said, they quietly started with the revisionism even years before their political comeback. Because their political comeback, they realized that it's not that easy, that it would take time. That's why they started first in their region, in the north, before they started out again at the national level. So they started there because they know they control that area, the northern part, so they would always win there, the gubernatorial and other local positions, but not the national. So it took years before they could really, remove the the stain on the name of the Marcos Sr., but they did it gradually, slowly, but surely, and it became ripe in 2022, especially so that they joined forces with the Dutertes in 2022.
Yeah, I remember how early this started, just reflecting on, I think it was early 2010s. There was Senator Amy Marcos. She wasn't a senator then. So Amy Marcos is the daughter of the late dictator, the sister of the current president. It was early 2010s, and she was the front cover of the Philippine Tatler, wearing a blood red gown, right? As if taunting the victims of human rights violations. And it was in a lot of bookstores in the Philippines. And what I did as a conscientious Filipino was to move the magazine from the magazine rack to the horror section of the bookshop, because we need to set the record straight. There is nothing glamorous about a blood red gown, right? That glamorizes the excesses of martial law. And I think what changed here is that from 2010s, when we still have these magazines that normalize the socialization of the Marcoses to the mainstream political and social circles in the Philippines, what's happening now is that they've embraced the digital culture, right? The influencer culture that speaks the language that people know. And I think this is quite dangerous, because while we know a lot about the disinformation networks that the Marcoses and the Dutertes have used, they're not just using disinformation anymore. Because disinformation, you can fact check. Disinformation, you can set the record straight. But if they're embracing the digital cultures of good vibes and toxic positivity, that you cannot fact check, right? They're appealing to values, actually. So when someone tells you, respect my opinion, that is actually coming from a certain value that, no, we're all pluralistic, we're all tolerant, just respect my opinion. When older people tell younger people, you're disrespecting me for questioning my support for the Marcoses, that's being disrespectful. Where's your filial piety, right? And that's the danger, because we are weaponizing not just information, but we are weaponizing values that Filipinos are supposed to be proud of, weaponizing values to silence dissent. And I think that is the genius behind that campaign. Their influence operation weaponized things that we should have going for us. How do you fact check that? But I think, just to end on a more positive note, if we can weaponize values against democracy, I think we can use values as well to save democracy, right? Like, there are common ground, there are shared values we have in the country, not just in the Philippines, but all over the world. And the question is, how can we use digital cultures to foreground the values that appeal to many people? Of course, there are many examples of youth-led protests now that appeal to shared values, that appeal to digital cultures. So I suppose my point is, this is not a foregone conclusion. This is still a very open-ended story.
Thank you, Nicole. That's perfect. And that's going to lead us to our last lightning round of comments. And then after that, we're going to get to some of your questions as well. So please be thinking about what you might want to ask. And playing off what you just said about shared values, Nicole, I'd like to have just a couple of sentences from each of you on the impact that these comebacks have made on democracy in each of these countries. And what does that say about where the electorate is at when it considers what it values in democratic values, and also what the candidates themselves or the politicians believe is the future of democracy. Adrian, let's start with you. A couple of sentences. I know it's a big topic to sum up quickly, but we would like to get through everybody before we get to our audience questions.
So I think the jury is still out, right? So with Trump's comeback, and as right, sort of Steve has mentioned all the things that are going on, the outcome of the great American experiment in constitutional democracy is I think, still up for grabs.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, Trump clearly does not believe in the U.S. system of checks and balances. You see him unilaterally redefining the Constitution when it comes to birthright citizenship. You see him refusing to spend money that Congress has appropriated with this new theory of a unitary executive authority. Now, the question is, will the system of checks and balances hold Trump's first term? We will find out relatively soon, because we're going to have a couple of Supreme Court cases that are coming up that are going to test whether or not our system of checks and balances hold. Will the Supreme Court do what it should do, and if it does, will Trump accept it? So as Adrian says, the jury is out right now on what's going to happen in the United States over the next few years.
Okay. Leila?
Contrary to the expectations of many, we didn't see actually the restoration of the authoritarian rule or the authoritarian legacy of the father and on the part of the Marcos Jr. I actually just see it as a diminutive, a parochial, a hiccup that won't last. It would only last up to 2028, as I mentioned earlier, because because it's nothing ideological about it. So no political movement behind it, no clear political agenda except the restoration. But it's not going to last. There's no sustainability in that kind of a setup. So, the democratic forces in the country are struggling actually, but with the kind of leadership and the kind of struggles, the kind of challenges besetting the Marcos administration now because of the corruption scandal, unprecedented. So it won't last.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my quick answer is I think the legacy of these comebacks is it really reduced our capacity to have difficult conversations and figure out what's next. And this is why, well, at least in the Philippines, I don't know in the US, we are quite sure there will be an election in 2028. But the challenge for us is to have that difficult conversation. What will replace the political comeback of authoritarian leaders? What kinds of movements and imperfect solidarities do we build to move forward? These are very difficult conversations. And the legacy of authoritarianism, arresting activists, reducing the power of journalists, that is very difficult. How can you have a decent political conversation while we're still reeling from the legacy of these regimes?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a microphone
Sure.
that is ready to go around. Anybody have a question, a quick question?
Yes,
Let's start up here in the front, if you don't mind.
I
And
believe
I'll
we
read-
have 15 minutes for this, so
Yeah.
please introduce yourself and get to the question quickly.
Yes, and please keep your questions short. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Evan Permana Sunjaya. I'm from Indonesia. I'm following the representative of Leila and Prof. Nicole. In Philippines or many other countries, many young people today did not live through the time of martial law or Marcos or authoritarian regime. They only know those stories from history books and social media. What they see now is a new generation of leaders who promise reform, but often repeat the same problem, perhaps corruption, inequality, and lack of progress. Because of this, many people start to feel disappointed, to look back, to pass for hope. In this situation, make it easier for all political families or figures to come back. When people feel that new leaders are not better, they begin to think that the past was stable and successful.
Can you just get to the question then, please? Thank you.
The question is, how can democracy wins people? How democracy win back people trust when both old and new leaders fail to bring real change? And how can young people create a new kind of leadership that is not based on nostalgia and populism, but on real reform and accountability? Thank you.
Democracy succeeds if we have an informed electorate. So we start always with electoral reforms. And we have, even if the things that are happening in our country now are very frustrating because of this, as I said, the unprecedented corruptions, even the biggest corruption scandal in our history. And it depends on how the Marcos administration will be handling it, the ongoing investigation. It could get worse, or there could be some closure to this. But then the 2025 elections gave us some hope because, the youth vote actually came out strong, but it could be stronger in 2025. So it depends. It depends on how things would work out in all of these major issues coming out. And then the youth vote, especially the students, the informed ones, we cannot, of course, afford to lose hope for our country with all of this happening. But I said that's why the opposition has to shape up and has to also show force, has to show strength, has to consolidate. That is the biggest challenge for our democracy, the opposition to consolidate and come up with viable a viable alternative in 2028. This is not going to be. I mean, the alternative between the Dutertes and the Marcoses cannot be the solution for our country, for democracy to stay alive in our country. Thank you.
Cool. A quick rejoinder.
Yeah, I think we also have to appreciate that democracy also happens beyond elections, right? For young people to be attracted to the practice, not the concept, but the practice of democracy is for it to be part of their everyday lived experience. So for example, what do we do with the protests happening in Indonesia and in the Philippines? Okay, we go out in the streets, we protest, and then what's next? So we should be able to channel those energies into something that is part of people's everyday lives. How can young people participate in investigating corruption allegations? What apps or platforms are available for them to report corruption that they see and act on it? I think one victory, for example, in the context of the Philippines, for example, is if citizens themselves became active participants in jailing corrupt politicians, in having collective investigations, and encouraging whistleblowers, right? So we need tangible achievements that young people can be proud of, that this is what happens when I participate in democracy, not just when I vote every now and then, but when I'm part of it and I actually do something about it. And that is the proof of concept, right? We just don't need democracy as a concept, we need it as a lived experience.
Next, yeah. Wait, who else would like to ask? I think we have time for maybe 3 questions. Can you ask the 3 questions already? So that we'll...
Sorry, the gentleman here and then the woman in red.
Yes.
Had her hand up. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for the insightful information. My name is Umar. I'm from Pakistan. We see the political instability in Europe and Asia. The youths are not happy with their political leaders, and they need dramatic changes. And this is also due to the fast flowing of information and social media. So, but for democratic states, there need to be long-term policies. Unfortunately, we are not following those long-term policies due to the information flow and the social media things. So what you guys will be recommending to the state leaders for long-term policies and the youths are demanding fast flow of information and changes. So what should the leaders be doing for the long-term democratic values for their countries?
Okay, that's one question. The lady, who's next?
Hi, my name is Amira, and I'm from Indonesia. And I think my question specifically relates to Professor Corrado's on how there's a trend of toxic positivity in terms of political campaign. And I think this reflects with my discussion with a friend who's a political sort of consultant. And I think a lot of this trend that we see with social media and populism really comes back to the root of how human behaviors and psychology responding to incentives on social media in a way that we all know that people respond to framing and how certain information are framed because it reflects to how people think and cognitive shortcut. It also reflects to how people are more emotional than rationals, and they kind of always respond to the biggest incentive, the easiest thing, the things that suit them and makes them feel good. And
Can you just get to the question then?
yeah. So what is your take when people will just say that this is all just marketing techniques, and whatever it takes, that people, if they want to win, they will just respond to the quickest methods of winning people's emotions. So what will your response be to that argument?
Thank you. And last question over there at the back. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Elvin from Singapore. So the commonality amongst the two countries is that for these narratives and frames of these political comebacks to have resonance, one other message must be true. And the message is democracy has failed to deliver for the people in these two countries. In the Philippines, poverty and inequality is still very high. In America, democracy has abandoned the middle class, inequality is still very high. So that's why these two populist narratives have resonance. So what would you say to people who feel that democracy has not been effective in delivering good outcomes for the people? Too much talk, too little action.
Thank you. Who'd like to answer the first question, how should leaders respond to an agitated youth calling for reforms?
I'll take a crack at that. In the US context, it is difficult because of the First Amendment, right? So it is almost impossible for, right, sort of the government, right, the federal government at least, right, to tell people what to do. But the problem I think we are seeing, and sort of as Steve alluded to in both, right, sort of Trump's 3 campaigns, and increasingly clear is the role and the influence of social media in political campaigning. Right? We're talking about algorithms deciding or what people see, what people view, and what people understand. Right? And also as we see increasingly, right, sort of people getting their news sources from social media. Right? So these things feed into one another. And we're also seeing, right, sort of politicians using social media to directly communicate with voters, right? So they're basically sidestepping traditional media as gatekeepers. So in the US context, it is, right, sort of really difficult for the government to regulate political speech, right? And when we have seen examples of that with Supreme Court rulings, right? And, right, sort of part of this is also, I think, right, sort of the controversy about, right, the fate of TikTok, right? The sale of TikTok.
Yeah, who'd like to answer the second question about, it's all marketing?
Oh, yeah, I can take that.
Okay, and then Steve.
I'm going to combine 2 and 3. So.
Yeah, I mean, you are a strategist. So at least based on my fieldwork, in the poorest communities in the Philippines, it's not just all about marketing. Even in the literal transactional form of vote buying, people will say, yeah, you gave me this money, but where were you when a typhoon happened? Right? So there is some discernment there as well. And I think what we also learned from some of the marketing that's happening in some of the campaigns is what really gains traction are campaigns that are more participatory, where people themselves can build on it, use their creativity, and repurpose the campaign, right? So I think, at least from our research, this hypodermic needle theory that you manipulate people, you give them some incentives, and then they will follow is not necessarily the case anymore, especially since the information ecosystem is so fragmented, and there's a lot of creativity and agency with voters, even with people that we expect are not educated, very poor, very vulnerable. Not necessarily. There's a lot of discernment happening on the ground. I think the challenge is how we can organize collective action and build on their anxieties and their values to make democracy work.
Thank you. Steve?
Populism is not new. This is Trump, Marcos, this is not something that has come out of nowhere. This has been for centuries, certainly the couple centuries of the United States. We have had eras of populism, and you can't blame social media, and you can't blame, let alone Trump or anything like that. So this is not a new phenomenon. Democracy has not failed the United States, but what you learn from where we are today, I think, are a couple things. And one thing that it is, the message is critical. And if you're running for office in the United States, I think if you're running for office anywhere, you need to show people how you are going to make their lives better. Right? And what Trump has been able to do with his Make America Great Again, well, you have to ask yourself, okay, that means America's not great now because you have to make it great again. So if it's not great now and he's going to make it great again, when was it great? And it was great, I would argue, what they're referring to is probably the 1950s, when we were a majority white country, when we were a country led by men, when women did not have the rights, if not de jure, de facto, that they have now, that we were not as equal a society as we were between men and women, white and blacks, let alone LGBTQ, who didn't have the rights in the United States that they have today. And so what it is, what the Democrats need to do now is show how you are going to make the voters' lives better today. And they're doing it in this battle of the shutdown right now, and why the Democrats are winning the narrative is because the Democrats are able to say, we are standing up for your rights for health care. And that is why they're winning. And they know when the Republicans say, oh, well, this is all about giving illegal aliens health care, and that's what the Democrats want. The people know that's not true, and that's why it's winning. What is it that the Democrats should be doing now? I wrote a column not that long ago with a couple of my former Clinton colleagues and Mike McCurry, who is the former White House press secretary I worked with, and I quoted him in there. What Mike said is that what the Democrats should be doing is going to the Trump voters, and don't insult the Trump voters. Don't say you don't know what you're doing. Don't say you're racist. Don't say you're voting against your self-interest. Go to the Trump voters and saying, is the world going to be a better place for your kids and your grandkids from what's happening today? And get into that discussion with them. And if you can get into that discussion about their lives, then the Democrats can counter. And so it is about messaging, but it's not about slogans, and it's not about social media. It's cutting through all of that. And I would say if there's one thing that you have to protect more than anything else, and boy, John will know this better than anyone on this panel, is you have to protect a free press. It's why Donald Trump is going after the media, why he's taking lawsuits against the media, why they're paying millions and millions of dollars, and why he's trying to intimidate them. And I hope that the media in the United States can follow the example of Rappler, because if that's the one thing we really do need to hold on to, and what I think every country needs to hold on to, is that free press, because that free press allows you to have that debate about messaging.
The third question was about addressing real failures of democracy. What do you say? Anyone want to take a crack at it?
I'll take more of a positive. It's, do you maintain all of those guardrails so you don't have an autocratic person come over and take over a country? You need to maintain the press. You need to maintain the courts. The business community should be speaking up. The business community should not be paying, $200 million to Donald Trump so he can destroy the East Wing of the White House and build a ballroom as a way to try and get into him. That's the type of corruption we used to never see in the United States. You've seen it in some of your countries. Now we're just the same pretty much as everybody else. So you've got to protect all of those institutions, and we're seeing that fight in the United States, and y'all are going through that fight still.
Just free thoughts. Okay, democracy, nobody can argue, has failures. But what's happening in our country now? There are threats to democracy in the form of these calls for revolutionary government, calls for civilian military junta, and because of, again, the corruption scandal. But our country cannot afford for democracy to fail. Our country cannot afford to have, the civilian military junta, and also installing the constitutional successor. The Filipinos know who the constitutional successor is. The best solution is to clean up, is to preserve our democratic institutions. In the words of our Cardinal Ambot David, is to redeem our democratic institutions instead of replacing them. So our democracy is under threat now because of this calls for revolutionary government installing civilian military junta. And that cannot be the solution. And we have to protect democracy at this point at all costs, in spite of serious grounds justifying revolutionary
The alternative is
government.
worse.
Yes.
Leila, thank you. We're going to give you the last word on that today. First of all, thank you to Fabian, to Glenn Chong, to Kat, to the CAS staff for letting us be up here today. Thanks to all of you for your questions and for your kind attention. Thanks, of course, to our panel today. Please give them a warm round of applause.